Research Fellow for Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology in the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for National Security.
Good morning, and thank you. For some of you may have come a little early. I apologize for what you had to brave coming in through. We had some folks of an opposing viewpoint, which we welcome. It can be a little loud and use some very profane language, and hopefully we won't see it on the way out. But again, thank you for your time today. Hopefully it's enlightening. It's got some new ideas, getting people to think perhaps differently about topics that we're going to discuss. Again, Heritage is a conservative think tank, but we welcome lots of viewpoints, and hopefully we'll have a very robust question and answer. I'm joined today by an old shipmate and friend, Alex Wooley, and I'll give a more proper introduction to him later. But the topic for the day is really an analysis of American statecraft. And there's two books. You may have seen up in the front when you came in. The first one came out 2 years ago. It was also kind of the context behind Alex and I talking about 2 years ago on China's investments in ports across the world and where there could be potential new bases. Sadly, American statecraft has not been up to the challenge. And you may ask, what exactly do you mean by statecraft? And that's the execution of national power, both in the economic, the military, the diplomatic, and the societal. We have not adapted, and there's been failure after failure. The subject of the first book was, what is that new statecraft? It's called Naval Statecraft, and it doesn't mean gunboat diplomacy. It isn't just big battleships off of people's coast. It's also economics. And the last administration embraced this. Maybe a surprise to some, but there is a very large bipartisan national groundswell to revitalize the nation's maritime industry. But it also embraces working with allies and partners like Japan and South Korea, and most notably, in getting them to invest in the United States as maritime industrial base. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, later. Now, the second book that came out just in September, Naval Power in Action, that is actually somewhat written out of frustration that things weren't moving fast enough. The world does not care about your feelings, and is certainly not going to take a pause while we get our house in order. So a few of the things as to why that antagonism or that anxiousness, South China Sea, Eastern Mediterranean from the Black Sea to the Red Sea, these are the decisive theaters. And we're seeing increasingly in the South China Sea a doubling of Chinese military presence right now off of Scarborough Shoal. There's an article out today about that from, I think, Carol, she's in the room, published just today on that. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Mediterranean, of course, there's a hot war, two of them. One is with the Houthis, backed by Iran, shooting at our U.S. Navy warships and other shipping going through there. And, of course, the war between Russia and Ukraine. All these things are connected, and they're connected by a maritime frame of mind. And that's the piece that we haven't really adapted to. Going back, for me personally, the trigger for why we needed to adapt to this was 2012, Scarborough Shoal standoff. A deal was struck, and that deal was reneged on by Beijing, and now we are still dealing with that today, the standoff. The other was the West Kapala crisis in 2020, something that's discussed in the first book and discussed again in the second book. And that is where you balance the naval presence with very forceful, explicit, not cute or overly complex language in your diplomacy, backed also with economic statecraft, which we're seeing. You started to see glimpses of it in the last 4 years. You're really seeing it today in the Caribbean. You're also seeing it, I think, in the trade deals and negotiations and the president's recent trip to Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, very importantly, my old station when I was working at the embassy in KL. And I think you're also seeing an attempt of it, and we'll see how it plays out in Russia, in the negotiations with Russia, rather. So one of the key things that you have to do is acknowledge that there's a need. The second thing is adjust and organize for the task. And the task is how to actually compete in a new state of being. It's a new Cold War, not of America's choosing. And I always point people back to the Tiananmen Papers that were snuck out of Beijing that made it very clear when the bodies were still warm in the square after the massacre in June of 1989 that the Chinese Communist Party viewed the United States as enemy number one. And that hasn't changed. And with that lens and that understanding, and if you haven't seen those papers, I encourage you to go read those. You can still find them, and you can still get it offline in books that have been published based on it. You have to reorganize for task. I'll talk a little bit more. There's a whole section of the new book that talks about this. A new National Security Council, very slim and to purpose, about executing rather than managing the interagency. A maritime department that takes all of the disparate agencies that are involved in shipping, shipbuilding, and our maritime security into one department, making an exception, of course, for the U.S. Navy, which is a warfighting, which would stay in the Department of War. Make sure to caveat that. And then also reorganizing the Navy, one centered on fleets, one that makes sense based on the nature of the maritimes, the shipping routes, the cultures that are connected in places like the Indian Ocean, which right now has 3 different numbered fleets, 3 different geographic combatant commands. They are not up to the challenges of the day, and certainly not to the new Cold War that we are confronting with the Chinese Communist Party. So I'll stop at that. Maybe I went a little over, and I apologize, but I'd like to introduce Alex. Alex Wooley is the Director of Partnerships and Communications at AidData. Now, a story that I like to tell is that Alex's organization saved me on a late Friday afternoon tasking from when I was working on the Chief of Naval Operations personal staff. And the question was, what are the Chinese doing with all of this money going into ports? And I'll leave it to him to share more about all of the great work he's done. One of his most recent reports, not the most recent, but one of the more recent, was one called Harboring Global Ambitions. I definitely encourage you to take a look at it, look at AidData's work, specifically focusing on China's global ports footprint, the implications to future naval bases. He's also a chairman of the AidData's Internal Africa Task Force, a project to identify and build relationships with strategic research partners across Africa. He has some operational and vast experience in the region as well as in media. He is a very prolific writer. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, I'll forgive you that, the NPR, Foreign Affairs, and the Times Literary Supplement. Alex is a former editor of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs and a former officer in the British Royal Navy. So 2 old sailors are going to be talking to you today. And again, it's great to have you here. Alex, why don't you come up to the stage and I'll turn it over to you. And as you're coming up, last time that he came here, it was front page news. So maybe today we can be front page news again.
Exactly. Thank you, Brent. Thanks, Brent, for that introduction, and thanks, as always, for hosting us here at Heritage. It's always an honor. So as Brent mentioned, I'm a director at AidData. That's a research lab at William & Mary down in Williamsburg, Virginia. And we've been conducting primary data collection on what China is financing and spending globally for more than 12 years. This is an ongoing, continuing effort. We employ 16 faculty and staff who do this work, as well as 120 research assistants at William & Mary. It is an ongoing, continuous effort to try and gather information through open source, what China is doing. All the data analysis that we gather, we put in the public domain. I will sort of foreshadow and say that our work is becoming increasingly difficult. Trying to track financial transactions that China is doing are becoming harder and harder, so making our job more difficult. You may know that China itself does not release detailed information about what it is funding where. And this was the original genesis for the project some 12 years ago. We recently released a comprehensive data set looking at Chinese financing globally. It's the largest, most comprehensive data set of its kind in the world. We track more than 1,100 official Chinese agencies or enterprises that are controlled by the government as they finance operations and projects overseas to the tune of, we have 30,000 plus projects in our new data set, valued at $2.2 trillion, which is 2 to 4 times higher than previous public estimates were for how much China is financing. So that was sort of one of our major finding. Together with 4 co-authors, we're now working on our next version of the China Ports report that Brent mentioned that we'll be releasing next month. And we're going to look a little bit more closely this time at sort of the ties between ports, the sea lines of communications, where is China vulnerable, where do commodities come from. We've also been studying critical minerals and how they get to China, the sort of continuous process by which they're gathered and shipped to China. So that's going to be another aspect. And we're also going to be delving a little bit more into the associated port infrastructure that China finances. So you may know that virtually every dockside crane is made in China. Security scanners are made in China. that equip the world's ports, including ports here in the US. So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be doing what we did in a previous report, which is geospatially mapping, looking at satellite imagery of the port, looking at the draft, is it deep enough to accommodate a large ship, et cetera. I'll give you a little bit of a preview or a sneak peek of the numbers on the ports financing that we have so far that we've been pulling, and we're doing a little bit more analysis of. So we capture in our new data set 181 ports projects worldwide that China is financing, worth about $32 billion. And that is in 93 unique ports around the world. And then we also capture 278 equipment for ports projects as well, worldwide, worth about another $3 billion in 57 unique ports. What is interesting is about a third of the ports that we look at are now in high-income countries, so China financing the wealthier countries, and about 40% are in Europe. So about 40% of the port financing that China does is in Europe. There's a couple of takeaways, and some of these build on the previous report that we did as well. One is that China has truly a global portfolio of ports worldwide. They are everywhere, and some of them are very well-known names, right under your nose, and other ones are in places that you've perhaps never heard of. So it's a global portfolio. Yes, they are focused on the key choke points that we all know about, but we also find there's a lot of financing of ports that are near choke points, so choke point adjacent, basically, which is interesting. One of the overall findings that the authors of our new sort of main report found was that there's an increasing decline of Chinese aid, what would traditionally be called foreign aid, and instead there's a movement towards financing typical sort of loans at commercial interest rates to high-income countries. So China is, in a sense, scaling down the BRI to a large degree, is still the world's largest creditor, is still the world's largest financier, but is moving to very exotic financing instruments, in part because that evades detection, evades transparency. So this is one of the things we find. We also identified that there's a clear effort to acquire, get a stake in critical infrastructure assets. Critical minerals is one of them, but ports, airports, et cetera. As you probably all know, sort of Piraeus port in Greece, Darwin in Australia, critical minerals in Greenland, in DRC, in Peru, et cetera. We also do an analysis looking at China's cross-border lending activities versus their stated economic statecraft party priorities. And we find increasing overlap with that. So what the government wants to do is where the money is flowing, basically, for those sort of national priorities that China has. Interesting, I think, from the ports point of view, which I think is interesting, is the ports are an end in itself because it sort of reaffirms China's maritime dominance or attempt to be maritime dominant. And it also provides the means by which they get these critical commodities and minerals, et cetera, to China. So it's almost a sort of double win from our point of view. I think another sort of key takeaway from this report and our larger report as well that I'm sure will sort of resonate with Brent is that China is really playing the long game, and they have been for decades. And so while the US was largely paying attention to other areas of the world, China was patiently building these long-term relationships with countries to build ports. You don't build a port overnight. So China has been sort of very sort of patiently involved in this, and we even see this in sort of the type of transactions they do. So they typically will have a series of loans or grants that build up their equity stake in a port, for example. So it's a very sort of patient, initially they may be taking a minority stake, then it slowly grows. Another aspect of their sort of work, which I think is interesting, is they increasingly want to be involved in syndicated loans to acquire ports. So they want to be involved with other financiers. There's increasing secrecy around those loans. and a lot of them now go through offshore centers. So we're obviously often trying to track down where in these offshore centers is the money and who ultimately controls the financing. So it's a very much a long-term story. At William & Mary, we've recently established an AUKUS Center of Excellence that is just standing up. And again, the idea of ports comes back to us on a domestic front as well, because obviously, and this is Brent's area of expertise, but the lack of shipyard capacity in the U.S. is so important. We're in Williamsburg, Virginia, so in the Hampton Roads area, we see this. I do some writing on shipbuilding, and when I sort of visit the shipyards in the region, you hear about how basically we're in a situation of maritime interrupted. So shipbuilding, everything, but including the shipyard workers themselves. So Newport News used to have multi-generations working on shipyards. And now there was a gap. And now they're trying to obviously restart that entire labor force from scratch. Whereas before it was guaranteed that grandfather to son to grandson would all work in the shipyard. So on so many fronts, we've seen this interrupted versus China, which has had a continuous sort of growth and progress. Thank you.
So thank you. We're going to shift to a moderated panel. Jeff Smith will lead, who's here from the Heritage Foundation.
I don't need an introduction.
Okay.
How you doing? Good. Well, fascinating discussion already. Eager to dive in, and also especially to leave some time for Q&A with the audience and those of you at home who are submitting questions digitally. I wanted to start off maybe asking both of you to tease out what I think is one of the core points of this discussion, which has been mentioned, but I think deserves more clarity and flavor. China is increasingly active in port projects around the world. The data on that is very clear. First question, what is China getting out of these port investments? Beyond merely commercial transactions, and why do we care? Why should we care? That question will go to both of you, but Alex first.
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental question, and it doesn't necessarily have to be either or, but and there's almost two camps on this, which is China engaged in building and expanding ports worldwide purely from the commercial profit motive, because they want to be able to sort of control the means by which they acquire commodities, et cetera. They want to make a profit. They're very capitalistic, despite their ideology, versus a clear strategic, cohesive, geostrategic aim that is in place, basically. And so everyone else is following. So I think there's really, you can come at it from those sort of two different ways, or is it a mix of the two? I think what we found sort of interesting is because we track, say, more than 1,100 official agencies in China that are financing, you can wonder, can it all be coordinated and controlled from one central place or not? Perhaps it can. But where does the profit motive come up against the clear sort of geostrategic element of it?
So in this most recent book, the first chapter talks about China's they reorganized for this in the last 10, 15 years to try to get a military utility or strategic utility out of their investments that they're making overseas. That's not to say it's the only thing they're doing. There's a profit-seeking, there's an opportunistic piece, but if they come into conflict, do what the PLA needs or what the Chinese Communist Party wants, or profit, it's what the Chinese Communist Party wants, always wins. And there's a saying in the Air Force, you know you're over the right target when the flak is thickest. And I say that with regards to when President Trump came into office the second time earlier this year. One of the hot button issues was buying out H.K. Hutchins' ports in Panama. That's a national security. There's an issue of the neutrality treaty being violated by Panama too that's still, I think, in debate. But China, Beijing's specific reaction to that was telling. They became very proactive and very energized to derail and to prevent that sale. because they've committed so much resources over so many years, not just to Panama, because HK was $8 billion in the hole, and this deal would have or almost $20 billion in the hole, and this would have balanced out their books. And turning over a whole archipelago of global ports that China was using and wanted to leverage for a whole bunch of reasons, economic coercion, political, as well as military, they couldn't have it. And it's still ongoing now. They want to insert Costco into that deal. That's a state-run entity. That would be worse than having what was previously existing. So what you have today with the ports presence, the massive control of shipbuilding, to include repair and shipping presence across the world in these ports, they effectively control the terms of trade. They can they can influence how cargo gets transshipped to the point to which your profit margin goes to zero or goes negative. Delaying ships, getting repair or being refueled. Lots of little things that you can throw sand into the gears of other people's businesses that actually can have a huge follow-on knock effect. Now, if it's a war, it's very different, and they're also positioned for that. And there's a new great game that's been going on in the South Pacific that's been kind of absent from a lot of discussion, but it's playing out there too in a big way.
So when I was working on South Asia, as a South Asia fellow, we spent quite a bit of time on Hambantota Port. And the concern at that point in time was that there was a sort of debt trap diplomacy going on, that China was financing the Hambantota Port under terms that Sri Lanka would be unable to repay, and that they may at some point eventually try to take an equity stake in the port or take control over the port. Has that concern been present in other ports around the world? Was that sort of a one-off? Is the concern more about sort of Chinese activities at the port, that they may now have opportunities for espionage, maritime domain awareness, access to critical infrastructure in the country? Is the debt trap diplomacy still a concern?
Yeah, I mean, sort of our position at AData is we don't sort of see debt trap diplomacy as it's traditionally identified, where you're physically taking ownership of a facility. But what we do see is basically sort of countries getting themselves into hot water financially, and China acquiring larger stakes in ports. And also, very interesting, having mechanisms by which they are always paid first. So in other words, a country has a Chinese investment for a port, but it also has money from the World Bank, maybe from the US, DFC, et cetera. When you dig out some of the secret clauses in these contracts, you'll find out that that's all great and good, but you pay us first. And they have to, for example, set up cash accounts, countries do, whereby China can directly, and in banks in China, where they will directly take the money out. And they have arrangements whereby the countries that are natural resource rich, there'll be a deal whereby sort of China, the sale of those commodities is going directly to China. So oil and coal and stuff like that. So they're guaranteed they get paid first, because as soon as the commodities are sold, the future commodities, the money goes to them. They also, interestingly, in a lot of their contracts around ports and other projects, have a secrecy clause. So they'll say, here's the interest rate, and here's the deal, here's the details. You're not allowed to reveal this to anybody else. And so we will get contracts sent to us where we analyze this. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, I remember in the Hambantota case, there was a secret agreement that China would essentially enjoy sovereign control over the port and the airspace above the port. Originally, that agreement was later discovered by a later government and renegotiated, but it was sort of sticking secret provisions into some of these arrangements that became extremely problematic. Brent, I want to turn to you, because both of your books, especially the most recent book, argued that American statecraft is essentially broken and needs an update. Was there a particular turning point which led you to believe that we had tilted into incompetence in our statecraft? And what are the one or two top things we need to do to right the ship?
Yeah, on specifically, just keeping focused in on the statecraft with regards to China, and also with national security aspects of this. It was that 2012 Scarborough Shoal a deal that was struck with the White House at the time and between Beijing and Manila. The Chinese were supposed to vacate. The Filipinos did honor their part of the deal, and they vacated. And the Chinese never did. They stayed. What that moment made it clear that hard power mattered, and also a trust but verify kind of approach. The Chinese were more than willing, and they had already were using cyber and they were using economic tools to coerce Manila at the time. So seeing them use all of these, but then from the DC perspective, only fixating on the vessels that were at sea around the shoal was missing the greater game and pressure campaign that Beijing was running. So for me, that was the spark. The 2020 West Kapala incident was enlightening because I could see all of the elements coming together for how to respond in a way that would be very effective, but it was luck. That was not by design. And that's what cinched it for me, that the ideas and what I had seen operationally in Malaysia as a defense attaché, also through my wide experience with the shipping and the shipbuilding world, that this was the way to go. A maritime-centered global approach in a long-term strategic competitive posture in a naval statecraft kind of framework. And you saw some of it in the Indo-Pacific strategic framework as well.
Okay. I guess, Alex, back to you. If it's a challenging state of affairs with China's shipbuilding and port access across the world, what can America do to better compete if we don't have the same state financing tools, we don't have the same industry of affordable infrastructure that we can provide? What should we be doing more of?
I think there's a couple of realizations, sort of cold water in the face. One is, as I mentioned, that China has been doing this for decades. Our data covers 2000 to 2023 through the end of 2023. And we see these port investments throughout that basically 24-year period. And so it's been a long-standing effort, and obviously they were also building ports before 2000, but that's where we start our data collection from. It's been a long-standing effort, and it's difficult to catch up with that. We said in our first report, I think you really have to sort of pick and choose, if you're the US, where you're going to try and compete against China, because it'll be very difficult to do it everywhere. And we also sort of, we want to sort of see like what investments make the most sense. Is it purely, again, sort of like a DFC commercially investing in US ports overseas, just in order, obviously, to sort of make a profit, et cetera, but establish US presence, versus dual use facilities, again, which is what we theorize China is interested in. They're not just doing this for financial reasons. They also want to be able to use these ports as potential naval facilities in the future, or listening posts. And then where should the US be investing in terms of solely a military base, for example? Mm-hmm. So I think these are all things that need to be thought through strategically. And then the biggest thing from my point of view is that then having the commitment to follow through long term. And that has always seemed to sort of waver a bit, whereas you're not really seeing China wavering, you're seeing China double down.
If I can, also, you said DFC, so I'm compelled to. One of the other key incidents or issues that played out in my experience and somewhat involved in was the Subic Bay, when Hanjin, that was the South Korean company that was doing operations there, owned the yard, was going bankrupt. The Chinese were ready and they had an offer to buy this very strategically important port in the Philippines that fronts into the South China Sea. The current Deputy Secretary of Defense was the CEO of Cerebus. Cerebus was one of the players to orchestrate a financial deal to prevent that from happening. This is the economic element of naval statecraft at play. There's more to be done. I'm heartened by a change of culture and approach at DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, that was repurposed from OPIC into what is now the Development Finance Corporation in 2018 with the BUILD Act. I think they're finally changing, and they're starting to get serious about infrastructure that has real strategic value. Mm-hmm. To get to Alex's point, you can't be everywhere, so we have to figure out where it matters. South China Sea is one of those decisive theaters. The other one, I think, is increasingly looking out over towards the Eastern Mediterranean, because the goal is you want to attract your biggest competitor, that can spread all over the world and cause all kinds of problems for you to have to deal with. You'd rather kind of focus where they have to act so you can regain the strategic initiative. South China Sea, Southeast Asia is number one. I think the Eastern Mediterranean is a very strong case for number two.
So you mentioned, Brent, in your remarks, Scarborough Shoal incident, the West Capella incident. Where are we seeing naval statecraft in action today?
I think there's a very strong case to be made that what you're seeing in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific going after the narco-terror cartels is another case of this. The military force that's being used, it's very clear. It started going after drug boats in the Caribbean, but then it spread to the Pacific. The reason for that, and the only rationale for that, is they're attacking the business model of the cartels. They rely on moving their product to the United States and to Europe. And the shipping routes go across international sea and air routes. If you were just to use the military in a military kind of role, you wouldn't be doing this way. So I see this as naval statecraft in action, a more lethal version of it, but the same. You are using your military with the economics in mind.
Alex, you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative briefly in your remarks. That's something we hear less about these days. I remember years ago that was everywhere. Is that still a part of China's global infrastructure financing? Has it just been de-emphasized? Have the terms changed?
I mean, some countries have backed out of it, obviously. And we still try and categorize, for one thing, it's never been exactly defined what it is and who's in and who's out. You sometimes find, countries that are on the west coast of South America are counted as part of BRI. It's a little bit all over the map. As I mentioned, I think what we see is a de-emphasizing proportionally on what China is spending to the BRI, because more funding in straight loans is going to the high-income countries, the wealthy countries of the world. So there's less to the BRI. But the BRI is still critical to China in terms of accessing commodities and resources. And so we still see those investments where they need materials, and those materials come from BRI countries as a rule. So that has not changed. But we also sort of see that, we call it the precautionary principle, where China is they're a little bit more sort of cautious than they were in the early days of BRI. And we actually, at ADATA, we say BRI 1.0 and BRI 2.0, which is really sort of from just before the pandemic onwards, where they're looking sort of a little bit more cautiously at how they do where they put their money. It's not a free-for-all where they're investing sort of everywhere. And then they're very concerned on how they're going to get repaid. And so there's sort of a lot of negotiations and deals in terms of sort of how we get our money back, what do we forgive in terms of sort of loan conditions, et cetera. And we also sort of see as countries adopt more stringent screening mechanisms that China very often will move somewhere else, basically. So the US, the UK, et cetera, other countries have, come in with these, regulations, rules. They have bodies which sort of say, okay, we're going to screen foreign investment in our country. Typically that will deter China to some degree and make them go somewhere else, which is one of the ways they do this is, as I mentioned, is through the syndicated loans and going through offshore centers, for example, to be able to sort of try and accomplish the same thing.
Well, before we turn it over to the audience, Brent, maybe another quick preview from your book. Is American statecraft changing fast enough to win the new Cold War?
Well, there's two sides to this equation. So in the book, it's all structured around an equation. It's deterring China, and I'm very much involved in the math that went into the Davidson window. So that's another deep dive for another day, another book perhaps. The goal is to deter conflict this decade so that there's enough time to adjust our institutions and also build up our military in league with our allies, our security treaty allies, so that we can continue that and maintain the peace from 2030 onward. Just because we might deter or prevent a conflict in 2027, 2028, doesn't mean that we've actually deterred China from its strategic goals and its willingness to use force to achieve those. So statecraft ain't moving fast enough to it. The one that's most frustrating to me is the institutional adjustments that for political, bureaucratic reasons is always the hardest thing to change. And usually, unfortunately, it requires a crisis. We have a crisis that I think is being acknowledged for like the last several years with China, the supply chain issues that came out of COVID, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East that we just went through. We're still fighting the Houthis in the Red Sea. So I think those things are all triggers. But the third element that we're missing is what's the plan, and that was what the book lays out. And I actually draft like what would be the next national security strategy, what would be the executive order for these things. So we need to reorganize. Until we reorganize, it's always going to be a struggle, and it's going to be reliant on who is in power or in a position of authority and the force of character and their knowledge and their willingness to take risk. We've got some of those people, but we're not moving fast enough, to say it shortly.
Well, if we had another hour, I'd ask you about the Jones Act, but we don't. So we're going to skip that, and we're going to go straight to audience questions. Yeah, we're good. Up front here, do we have a mic?
It's coming.
Thank you very much. So there's to me, it seems there's an overarching question that I'd like to ask you to address, which is every 4 years we have a change of administration. And if we take a look at what's been going on in the last 10 years, it's very difficult to achieve any kind of consensus. How do you see this as influencing these issues?
If I can take that first, I actually see a consistency, and that 2012 Scarborough Shoal crisis had so thoroughly diminished or discredited the China is a partner, or China can be a responsible stakeholder in a capitalistic, free, democratic kind of global view, and that group hasn't come back, and it's been grudgingly, but pretty much consistent. If you look at the national security strategies and national defense strategies more specifically, there's a consistency that goes from Democrat, Republican to Democrat to Republican. It's become much more sharper. Maybe the language may not be, to some people's more sensitive feelings about the language that's used in the diplomacy, but the direction and the specific focus has not changed. I would say if you look back at the Biden administration, the first 6 months, 7 months, they tried to roll the clock back to pre-2012, and it failed spectacularly with the Anchorage, Alaska meetings, and they never really kind of picked that back up to try to go forward. They basically came back to where the trend lines have been going, a more realist, common sense approach to China, which in some cases is more transactional also at the same time. So I would say there's a consensus, and I'd say the other key thing is up on the Hill in Congress. Both Democrats and Republicans, the consensus is China is not our friend, and that we have to do a lot more to treat them with a lot more concern and consideration than we have been.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add that we're in academia, we're researchers. There's always been, I would say, bipartisan support for what we're doing and belief. No one ever sort of questions whether what we're finding is true or not. So that's been very encouraging. I think what's interesting is we also do presentations and rollouts of our data in Europe, and I've noticed a sea change there over the past dozen years. Yeah. When we would present in the UK, for example, government officials would say, well, Chinese tourists, Chinese university students, we're not going to turn them away, so we'd rather downplay what you're seeing as being a problem, and instead, how can we get along? And I think that has shifted to something sort of harder line within Western Europe anyways.
Mm-hmm. Back here first. We'll come up.
Yes, Virginia Allen with the Daily Signal. Wanted to ask a follow-up on that, specifically Mr. Woodley. So you talk about giving those presentations. Have you seen an openness on the part of the Trump administration to look at your data, use your data? Is there an interest to really be looking at that, but then also to take action on it?
Definitely there's always been heightened interest, but we've seen sort of access to our data, which again is all publicly available, increased steadily over the years. And it's funny because when we first started researching China a dozen years ago, we couldn't get any funding for the work, and no one was interested in the work. Everyone was focused on sort of still the Afghanistans and Iraq and stuff. So we were doing this largely on our own dime. But we've seen sort of steady increase. Sort of our executive director, Brad Parks, is regularly sort of called to the Hill, et cetera, to testify. And we're sort of in regular contact with U.S. government officials as well about our research, and also with governments and international organizations worldwide. Interestingly enough, when we just did our most recent release, we had a sudden spike in the days before from China itself. And we were surprised by this because we're banned in China. And then the spike abruptly dropped to 0 and spiked in Hong Kong. And it's been a bit of a sea change because we used to have the Chinese embassy would ask us, tell us about your data, in part because, as I say, we track 1,100 agencies. It's so siloed in China that if you're working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MOFCOM, the commercial ministry, doesn't know what MOFA is spending. And so we found out from talking to sort of officials in China that they were using the data from a liberal arts college in Virginia to find out what they were doing overseas, collectively, holistically, because the officials themselves did not have access to that information. But, yeah.
Got right here.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Solomon. I'm from Eritrea. I think something missed on the Red Sea region around, we know from the experience for the last 34 years almost, we have a dictator in Eritrea, and the Chinese influence is growing in the region. In Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Sudan, even Yemen, Houthi. We see American ships attack in the region, in the Red Sea, but not Chinese ships. So what I'm saying now is, what is American plan or in the statecraft in the region, specifically with Eritrea? We ask Americans, what they say is, China doesn't have military base in Eritrea, but they have the greatest influence, more than America, in schools, roads, and Chinese company, mining companies, they're still working hard in Eritrea. But after the regime collapse, what's the America plan? Because Chinese have already the plan, everything there. They play long term. What is the American plan? I want to see that.
East Africa.
Yeah, East Africa. So I see the same thing in other places. So it's a very familiar, and one in which I grew up in the Pacific Island, also sea. So there's a long history here that predates the current kind of Chinese Communist Party's efforts to have access and influence, beginning in the mid-90s, really. With respect to East Africa, the fact that the Chinese were being given safe passage while others were being attacked by the Houthis was not missed by those that matter, and that was taken note. The threat was, quite frankly, and the Chinese were sanctioning it, on the global shipping market. Now, I've tried to get European allies and partners kind of get to look at it differently, because their shipping firms were being paid, they'd have to pay more for insurance, and they were having to go around Africa in order to get to their markets in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia. But yet the Chinese were moving European products at a lower rate, so they were putting them out of business in some respects, or at least taking the money from them. So you have to look at it from a more systematic, the maritime piece, and that's partly what was going on from the China part. The Houthis, of course, were acting on behest of Iran. There's a very strong case for that. The weapons overwhelmingly came from Iran. The long-term plan for the United States specifically in that part of the world is twofold. One, it's a decisive theater. China has banked a lot of their future global vision in controlling or having access to Europe. It's a huge economy. It's also one in which could influence what happens in Eurasia. So they want to have that. That's that maritime Silk Road. So they want to have that. So if you can challenge that, you're going to draw their attention, their resources to that region, to where the United States wants it to be done. So take the initiative. It's also the Russians are very much in the place. We didn't talk about Port Sudan as well. there's a Russian need to be there too, and we can't get distracted. So focus in on the region. So that's the geostrategic aspect of it. The economic is how can we make sure that shipping, which overwhelmingly is more of a European interest, remains free and open. And so I think it behooves all of us that there is stability and strong governments that don't threaten international trade that passes by or into their ports in that part of the world, to include Yemen, Eritrea, Somalia, as well as Djibouti, which has been host to U.S. as well as Chinese and Japanese bases, and French too, for quite some time. So the jury is out as to whether or not that arrangement is going to work out or if it's going to expand. But it comes down to shipping and trade, I think, and the protection of it.
Good morning. Thanks a bunch for the briefing. Sergio de la Peña, given that technology is making it more difficult for us to hide, especially on water, and given that boats are made out of metal and metal doesn't float well if it's got holes in it, what is the plan for modifying aircraft carriers as the key platform for naval supremacy over time, given that it's going to be more difficult with the lethality of weapons and the ability to be spotted? What are we doing about looking at a next generation of aircraft carriers? Or we keep the ones we have, put more power on the platform so that you can have something like directed energy that can protect them? Or are we going to start looking at maybe smaller platforms?
Yeah, it's great to see you again, Sergio, and apologize I haven't been to as active as I need to be in another agenda that we share. The first book dives into this very deeply. I follow a lesson that was given to me by my grandfather, who was a naval architect, fought in the Pacific War, and that is the wing walker's prayer. You don't let go of one thing until you have a firm grasp of another, because you don't want to fall off the wing of the plane to your death. So in this case, aircraft carriers have proven their worth in combat, time and time again. There's no easy replacement for that, and having fixed bases on islands or in Japan or in the Philippines, there's a political question, of course, the host nation has to agree to. There's a lot of infrastructure. It's an easy target for a ballistic missile, by the way. An aircraft carrier at least moves, and you can surge in and surge out. You're constantly changing the targeting dynamics on the Chinese, so I don't see any easy replacement. That's not to say that you can keep doing the same thing, because that's guarantee of failure. In the first book, I talk about escort carriers. An escort carrier, for those that may not be familiar, is a little bit different size, different mission. Carriers like the Ford, they're for strike. That's for going in and taking out bad guys, targets on land, and sustaining it 5-6 days at a time. And it's intensive combat operations. But you have to protect your ships or conduct screening operations, not strikes. You need aircraft that can take out other aircraft or suppress the air defenses. That's a different type of aircraft. That could be much more drone. And you want things that can loiter longer than a manned aircraft. So I think there's a need for a new escort carrier. One version is a Lightning carrier using the LHAs, the assault carrier, that we already have, the Marines are on. That could be adequate. I think there's a very strong case for a nuclear-powered escort carrier, an iteration of the Ford class, built perhaps at another yard, that actually does this. This, of course, is a generational proposition. If war happens sooner, guess what? You're going to be producing them, guaranteed.
And Brent,
Yeah.
it's also interesting that China built the Blue Water Navy from scratch, and they're doubling down on aircraft carriers as well.
Yep.
They didn't have any legacy interest in aircraft carrier. They could have gone any way they wanted, but instead, bigger and bigger, and
Yeah.
catapult, etc.
Yeah, the electric catapult is a key. That is a game changer. And there's a reason why the Chinese putting it on their most recent aircraft is why we have it on the Ford. It allows you to you have like a rheostat. You can dial it down. So when you get, and I'm a submariner for 26 years. I've been on aircraft. I've been shot off them. There's no way in hell I wanted to do that because it's not my thing flying. But that's a lot of force. It's a lot of shock on an aircraft. When you have an electronic catapult, you can dial down the stresses so that you can launch smaller drones off the same platform. And you can also dial up the force so that you can launch more heavily laden aircraft. Think about the long-range air-launched ballistic missiles that have like 1,000-mile range. Think about the very long-range air-to-air missiles that are currently coming to the end of their development, you might see being deployed from U.S. aircraft soon. These are big. We, in some respects, are going back to the F-14 Tomcat of the past, but a modern version of it. So you have to be able to launch these aircraft that are going to be heavier and bigger, and dialing up that rheostat capability down for the heavy aircraft, and then dialing it down so you don't break anything is key. So there's other technologies, other developments that can go on to it. Defenses, I think the discussion that's coming about, maybe in the next few, we'll hear about battleships, so more to follow. I also think it's time to revisit the notion of naval armor and using things like additive manufacturing, 3D printing and steel, and trying to create some very interesting and unique novel approaches to naval armor. It's going to be coming from the top side, but you also have anti-ship cruise missiles come from the side. It's not going to be World War II belts of like steel. It's going to be something a little bit more novel, I think, in the future.
I think we have a question from online in the back. Alan?
Hi, yes. This is a question for the entire panel. China's economic strategy thus far has hinged on the concept of dual circulation, domestically bolstering its national economy and then globally engaging the international markets. But now that China is facing a lot of domestic turbulences at home, and growingly old demographic, slowing GDP, as well as a slew of other issues, to what extent does that domestic drawback affect its ability to continue financing these large-scale infrastructures globally?
So far we have, maybe the tail is quite long on this. We have, as I say, not seen sort of a dramatic drop-off. And as I say, China remains the single largest financier and creditor officially in the world. So that hasn't happened. If anything, we sort of see, again, this strategic idea of targeting critical infrastructure, critical minerals, et cetera. China wanting to essentially have a monopolistic control of those. So it's possible that the funding, the financing is just becoming a little bit more calculated, a little bit more strategic than it was, I think. But definitely the numbers are still enormous.
Who, if you don't mind me asking, maybe you have it off the top of your head, maybe you don't, but China's number one. Do you know 2, 3, and 4?
I think after number one, it's the international banks like the World Bank, IFC, et cetera. But yeah, China's.
I know Japan is often up near the top as well. Yep. We've got a few more questions here from the audience. We've got about 5 minutes left in the program.
Thank you. I agree totally with your assessment that today we're in a far worse off position than we were in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. So we haven't really done a very good job of managing the world. The object of strategy is to achieve some objective. So the question is, what is the U.S. objective? And I would postulate that what benefits the U.S. the most is the world that is at peace and economically prosperous. The more the world is at peace, the more secure we are, the more economically prosperous we are, the world is, so are we. So the question then comes, is it now benefit for China, because everything we talked about China, they're really trying to improve their economic position. So is China improving in its economic position something that would benefit us and our goal and our objective, or is that a threat to us and it is going to take away from our threat? And I put it in the context that after World War II, we rehabilitated economically Germany and Japan, and they were key in being able to destroy or let the Soviet Union fail. And so the same question is our relationship with China. Do we benefit by having a relationship of confrontation, looking at them as an adversary, or is it better for us to look at them in the sense of collaboration, how we can create a win-win situation? And I would postulate over the last 30 years or so, the most successful international relationship up until recently has been the U.S.-China relationship. It was really good for China. It was really good for U.S. investors and the U.S. economy, for our T-bills and everything else. So what attitude should we take towards China? One of collaboration or one of confrontation?
Well, I know Jeff's got some opinions on this one too, but I'll tell you from my experience, that was the consensus opinion. It was business. It's like the more that we did business with China, they would adopt a more free and open economic model. They're communist. It's state controlled, and nothing can challenge the authority and the dominance of the Chinese Communist Party. In stop. And the reality, I think we've come to terms with that in the last few years, that what's good for China doesn't necessarily mean a win for anyone else. So we have to have a much more, some would say mercantilistic, I would say reciprocal relationship. And we have to be much more realist about what we're getting out of it. When you sign a contract with the Chinese, and I know this from many years of folks in business, that's not the end. And you can't assume that next year that they're still going to be doing what's written in the contract. It's a living document that they'll adjust when it no longer serves. So you have to be engaged. It's not like I got to the end point now where we can move to something else. No, it's a condition of being, just in doing business with the Chinese. And the fact is we can't lose sight that they are an authoritative regime. They are not, they're not really focused in on advancing democracy, nor are they interested in advancing free and open markets either, because that does pose a risk, again, back to the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly of power and authority back home. So I think this view has actually shifted in the last few years. And I think it's a healthy one to be much more explicit about what we want in the relationship and also what our expectations are that are not philosophical or ideological, but more hard, easy, and tangible things. Like don't build a base on islands, man-made islands in the South China Sea. Don't support or allow your industry, chemical companies, shipping in fentanyl precursors. These are very specific things. Rather than you need to be much more, you have to have better human rights. That's not to say you don't have that discussion, but we need to be very specific and very focused, even on those formally like philosophical or ideological disputes that we've had with them. And we have to demand results.
The other thing, in our very sort of narrow window that I work in, where you're looking at finance, I think you have to acknowledge that sort of China comes into it with the idea that there's a renunciation of international norms. And so, for example, most countries, organizations, they report to the OECD on what they're spending, et cetera. China all along in this area and others has basically said, we don't even like those bodies, those rules, the norms, the transparency, we're not interested in that. So they already come at it from this point of view of they're creating a parallel alternative order that they would like to welcome other sort of countries, et cetera, to join, and that our order is going to lose, basically, the international order that has been around for decades or centuries. So that, I think, is also sort of conscious. In the past, we've had rivals who still contribute to these international norms, et cetera, but they did not completely sort of depart from them, for example.
Yeah, I guess I find the analogy with Japan and Germany a little odd. We developed a very constructive win-win relationship with them after they became allied democracies that were committed to non-aggression abroad. If China were to become an allied democracy committed to non-aggression abroad, we could have a very constructive relationship with them economically. That's not the case today. And I don't think anyone would have argued for us to have a better trading relationship with Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany back in the day to build a constructive win-win relationship with them. There were very good reasons why we didn't want that kind of relationship with them. So if China were to change, I'm sure our policy toward them would change. It looks like we've run out of time. Thank you especially to our guest speakers today. Thank you to the audience, everybody watching from home. Let's give them a round of applause.